Well, hello again, everybody, and thank you for being on this breakout group. I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'm Kirill Zarad. I'm from the Office of Medical Policy at the FDA Center for Drugs. My office works on policy tracks around the digitization, digital healthcare, and decentralized clinical trials, and a lot of other very fascinating and interesting topics. So I'm excited to be with all of you today. I want to suggest starting by everybody stating their name and their affiliation, so we will familiarize ourselves with who's on this group. After that, I'm going to ask for a volunteer who can report out when we go back to the meeting on our deliberation. So may I ask you, anybody who would like to start introducing themselves and their affiliation, please?
Sure, I'll go first. I can never tell what order people are in someone else's Zoom screen. I'm Greg Simon. I'm a psychiatrist by clinical training, mental health services researcher. I work at Kaiser Permanente, and I'm also a member of the larger drug forum.
Thank you. Okay. Megan, do you want to go next? Oh, go ahead, Pat. Sorry.
I'm Pat Furlong. I work with Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. It's a rare disease group focused on Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Thank you.
I think everybody figured out who I am. I'm Shannon's mom.
Thank you. But for the recording, would you mind just saying your name and just in case somebody's joining us in the middle?
Sure. I'm Megan O'Boyle. I am a member of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, PI of the registry, and head of patient engagement at rarex.org.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Patty Doikis. I'm a director in the Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation and leading the Health Equity Initiative on the business side for our company.
Thank you. Welcome. Let's see, who are we missing? Nicole or Tina, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, my name is Tina Tong, and I am the Associate Director of the Vaccine Research Program at the Division of AIDS, which is within NIAID at NIH. I've spent approximately 20 years really focused on HIV vaccine research and development, and recently have been pulled into the COVID-19 vaccine development efforts on the US government side. So excited to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Nicole Wickie. I work for a nonprofit based in Belgium called The Synergist. I'm a program manager in patient-focused medicines development and also in FT3, or from testing to targeted treatments. So I used to work as a patient advocate with Myeloma Patients Europe and also in patient advocacy years ago at Celgene. And I'm a cancer survivor myself.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. See, Victoria, you're next, I believe, or?
Hi, yes, I am Victoria. I'm a senior editor for Nature, and I handle a lot of clinical and translational research. And I'm also part of our working groups that, try to improve data access and reporting, and how to make sure that patients are protected, and we do our best in reporting clinical trials. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being with us. Am I missing somebody else? I had this question, but anybody else that we did not mention? I see Melvin.
Yes, I'm from ASM staff.
Thank you. Hi, Melvin. Andrew.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm also from the National Academy staff.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So let's go ahead and start with the discussion. But before we jump in, I need a volunteer to keep track and maybe report for us after we join the group. Would somebody volunteer, please, to take that role?
I can do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. I'm not able to join to actually share my screen, just FYI. So I'm going to go ahead and read until maybe I get an option to share my screen. We were tasked today with answering two questions. The first question, I'm going to read it out loud, is what are the 1 to 2 short-term tangible and measurable goals to ensure a more here we go. Thank you for that. To ensure a more person-centered and inclusive clinical trial enterprise that should be met within the next 5 years. And I want to stress 5 years because we're going to have a chance to discuss 10 years. later on. And again, the two things to remember here, tangible and measurable goals. And then they provided us also with goals that I think stemmed from the previous discussions. On the first meeting in January, I believe there was a really good discussion around this topic for those who would like to look it up. But the goals are strengthening the workforce, and you see the three main items underneath it: engage and invest in minority serving institutions, early career researchers and medical schools to prepare and mentor a diverse workforce, engage with family physicians and other primary care providers working in the community, including them early on in a trial design and implementation to improve recruitment and expand the clinical trials network, and then requiring diversity, equity, and inclusion education, as well as implicit bias training for the clinical trials workforce. And then the second goal is invest in a community-based participatory research, establishing a nourishing patient and community-based partnership to support person-centered outreach, including through public-private partnership. And the example given is NIH, pharmaceutical companies, community-based organizations. And then embedding clinical trials and research in the communities in which patients live and work. And then engaging, supporting, hiring community-based leaders, clinicians, and patients to carry out research, advocacy, and build trust within the community. And of course, other short goals to ensure the more person-centered and inclusive clinical trials. Now, if you go back to the question on the top before we jump into the discussion, I think just a reminder, we're tasked with choosing, first of all, 1 to 2 short-term tangible measurable goals, and then answering the key questions about those goals. For example, what action we need to take to achieve those goals, and how should progress be measured, and what stakeholders should be involved to achieve that goal. With that, I want to open it up for discussion. I think we have a lot from the last conversations we heard at the main session regarding this topic, but who would like to start us off? Any comments? So
yeah, I was going to say, the challenge here, I think, is that in some ways the most important thing is the hardest thing to measure. Mm-hmm. Certainly it's possible to measure against the goal of efficiency, which is just, do trials recruit adequate numbers of people or faster? And that's measurable. And I think it's also possible to measure representativeness. Are the people who participate in clinical trials more representative of the population who should be served by this treatment, or to whom the results would generalize? But, we heard a lot of people talk about the much more important upstream issue, which is, is the entire enterprise oriented toward the people it would hope to serve, which starts with what question should you even be asking? And that one is the hardest to measure. Because what you're talking about is really sort of a fundamental transformation of the orientation of the people in charge. And it's a little harder, maybe a lot harder, to put a number on that. I was thinking, ironically, as we're doing this for a totally different, I have a stack of PCORI grant applications on my desk that I've been reviewing for, a PCORI study section. And what you're trying to do, of course, is to read through the description of what people are doing to say, but do they really get it? How much of it, can you tell from the description of a process that people are actually, from the very beginning saying, why are we doing this and what's our goal? And that's hard to measure. So I think, I'm not saying we should not measure some of those downstream consequences. I think, they're important and they need to be measured, but probably also important to acknowledge that the challenge of measuring that thing which is most important.
Thank you. I think that's a challenge. And when you're talking, it reminds me, maybe I'm biased thinking of GCB specifically. Like, how far can we go, for example, in GCB training and thinking around GCB, good clinical practice, and incorporating, the concepts that we're talking about, like being person-centered, even what we heard from the discussion around informed consent, where to start, I guess. You talk about upstream, and I'm wondering where to start. And I think it's a big challenge, thinking of what Janet Woodcock said yesterday about community clinical research centers, how to form all that infrastructure that's needed around that. Anybody else would like to comment?
I think I can just add to what Greg said, but that also feeds into something that Megan had said earlier about the time that it takes in terms of from the time you collect the data until you have an output. And I think my instinct is to say that it's really about correctly identifying the areas of unmet need. And if that is done really effectively, then that also would uncover things such as in which community settings would a trial need to be taking place. If it is a proven area of unmet need, then the accrual in a trial should then be filling that need in its very essence. And therefore that should lead to better enrollment and so on. So, but in terms of how you can effectively measure the assessment aspect in terms of determining that unmet need, whether it's through patient preference studies or so on, and what advice you can get there is that's a little bit tricky. I think that really comes down to systematic and effective patient engagement to understand really your community more broadly. But again, that's really hard to systematically implement. And then because of that, tough to measure.
Yeah, I think one of the goals we have is embedding clinical trials and research in the communities, which is hard, is easy to say, but it's really thinking about that integration in a way that you identify the unmet need and address it. That's a big challenge. Thank you for that.
This is Megan, and I know I only have one lens, and it's rare disease, but in rare disease, especially where you have caregivers, finding out what their concerns are is not the challenge. It's getting it heard and asking the question the right way. What are you most scared of is very different than what is affecting your quality of life the most. GI issues and sleep issues affect our quality of life. We're most scared of a child dying of a seizure in the middle of the night. So I come from a world where getting that information, one, is not asked by a clinician. I mean, the clinicians are the last people that know anything about us because they usually have one patient. It's the organizations. And I think that might be more challenging when there's common diseases. I want to shift and cut me off if I'm going in the wrong direction, but I think COVID has introduced us and forced us into something that's really important to consider in the next 5 years, and that's telemedicine. And one of the problems with not being able to participate in clinical trials is not able to get your child easily in his wheelchair from point A to point B in an airport, or the upfront cost of being in hotels, or I can't leave my job because I need to pay the mortgage. And this week alone, I have a telemedicine appointment with the NIH for an RDCRN study that my daughter is in. It is year 6. We usually walk into building 50 or building 10, and instead I will do a Zoom with the neurologist and I will chase my daughter around with the laptop. And that will be, our first try at a telemedicine appointment. But I've suggested, and Dr. Simon as a psychiatrist can, maybe weigh in on this. There are things that could be done with the right tools, like short videos with smartphones, wearables, and things like that, that could really open doors for at-home clinical trials. Phlebotomists can come to your home, and everybody can wear a mask. And parents and people can be taught how to use video to, in our instance, you have developmental, cognitive, and motor development. The family could be given a list of things that have to be done. You take video every week and you submit it. And yes, I know there's identification problems, but you realize I'm not as concerned with that. The Parkinson's community has proven that you can, wear a certain type of watch and collect data. So I think maybe we use COVID as an opportunity to start thinking out of the box about making some of these clinical trials more accessible. Because, in a lot of diseases, the patients don't live where the trials are happening. And it's a hardship to have to take time off. I'll stop there.
That's a great comment. Actually, in the next session, we're going to have a discussion on the technology itself. And I think you really hit multiple aspects here, including, how to do hybrid trials, decentralized trial, and utilize all this technology to facilitate those trials within the communities. So yeah, no, I think it's a great point, Megan. I'm wondering if we can project the goals again. I just want to, from that perspective, just to hone down the discussion a little bit. And again, I'm going to ask you again, Megan, what do you see, if you can scroll down a little bit so maybe we can get a fuller picture of the goal, that's okay. Thank you so much. But like, what do you see? I think a lot of you touched on multiple aspects here. And I'm curious, where do you see the priorities? You know, I think it's hard to identify priority, of course, but where do you see a tangible priority here that can be addressed or should be addressed in the next 5 years, short term per se?
This is Patty Doikis from Bristol-Myers Squibb Foundation. So I know there has been a lot of work on patient-centered outcomes, but I'm not sure that a strong framework for what are patient-centered outcomes, and then particularly for underserved populations as well. You know, a framework being well understood, a lot of education about what that is. And also, you know, we can't always have to like double and triple solve in these things and get more out of the opportunity for interaction with the patient through a clinical trial as an example. And, you know, address some other needs, get some more information that can help you, as was noted earlier, in terms of sort of after the trial, what happens in the world in terms of access and how the model of care wrapped around, say, a medicine that's been brought forward will actually look like, so that it works in medically underserved populations and low resource settings, et cetera. So I think the patient-centered outcomes sort of framework that goes deeper into the patient experience, what they want to get out of even participating, how the experience has been for them, and then really thinking about you know, aspects of the model of care that's going to need to be in place to actually utilize whatever intervention or technology has been brought forward, and not in the, you know, super resource setting, but really being realistic about these different settings, because some of these technologies are built for disparities from the get-go, and just having more patient input on how to mitigate those challenges in access and utilization and participating in clinical trials.
Thank you. That is very helpful, very insightful. Thank you.
And this is Tina. I hope you all can hear me. And I just want to build off of what's already been said regarding the COVID experience. This is something that is near and dear to sort of what I'm really passionate about, which is really strengthening the workforce. And I think that what we can do in terms of putting all of these pieces together, in terms of all the suggestions and the inputs that you all have just given, is that we have a perfect case in terms of COVID has required us to think differently. I can speak in terms of what we've done, operationalize multiple phase 3 trials within the past 10 months that many said we couldn't do. You know, it really is amazing to think that, you know, from the time of publishing of the sequence in January, you know, in December, we had 2 EUA approved vaccines. And so what that did was require everyone at all levels to think differently. You know, I can't help but, you know, empathize with all the ICF comments. That's something that, you know, we are constantly struggling with. What we were able to do, as an example, in the COVID setting was do things like use telemedicine for consent, right? You know, we had to think differently. You know, having to really sort of leverage lessons learned. And I think that that's something that from a governmental perspective, I think that we are always trying to do. We're always trying to gather those things, write them down, learn from them. But and again, I'm speaking personally on behalf of myself, I think that what's really lacking, and there's a strong gap, is in terms of, you know, going that next step. So, okay, this is what we learned from this experience, but what are we gonna do about it? You know, and I can give really tangible things in terms of, you know, getting out to the populations most affected by this disease. They're not necessarily located in city centers. You know, they don't necessarily have public transportation. What did that require us to do? We had to have mobile clinics, and then we had to convince IRBs that we could still have proper oversight over study participants. You know, we could do, you know, clinical exams, we could administer vaccine, keep it at proper storage temperature, et cetera, in a mobile van that was literally driving around, you know, rural parts of America. And then I think about some of the things that I think it was Nicole mentioned, really sort of figuring out, well, you know, enrollment technically shouldn't be difficult if you're actually doing the studies in the areas in which, you know, those people are affected. And so, you know, I think one of the enterprises that we used at the NIH as well was sort of, you know, a lot of our predictive analytics groups, and trying to pinpoint where incidence would be highest for COVID and where we actually needed to have our clinical trial sites. And you know, we did something that some commercial clinical trial sites aren't that familiar with, and that's use of satellite sites, is what we call them within sort of the academic sphere. So again, it's, you know, sites that are, you know, 30 to 50 miles from a city center. And so I think that at least, again, from my own perspective, it's really caused me to think differently. A lot of the work that we do within the division within HIV vaccines is international. So we've had to think about those types of things, but then apply them here within the context of the US. And so I think, again, with that ultimate goal of, which I think was the first thing you had shown at the start of this, was that, you know, this was such a monumental effort that had just the workforce at every level. And so I think capturing the perspectives and the lessons learned, and sort of coming up with some sort of, I don't want to say a guidance document, because that's a very FDA term, but, you know, like getting really tangible, you know, like why isn't there an ICF template that, you know, that organizations can use? You know, I think, you know, Megan, your comments on reading level, this is something we constantly struggle with. I think earlier, when we were in the group session, you know, something I've struggled with is getting translation, you know, translations done in a timely manner. And when we, just because of the environment we've been in and having to enroll so many people in such a fast amount of time, you know, there was no lack of people willing to sign up for these trials. And I think we have so much to learn from them. And I think if we could see those in types of investments there, I think we can just learn so much. But there needs to be, I'm not saying I know what that is, but I think there needs to be some sort of work product that comes out of this covert effort, the COVID efforts, and, you know, and really looking at, okay, well, what happened locally versus at the state level versus at the federal level, and figuring out ways, you know, that we can just get people to think outside of the box, doing things in parallel rather than sequential, you know, getting IRBs to, you know, it required everyone to do things differently, because of the sense of urgency. And I think that if we can really capture that somewhere, somehow, you know, we can really get the focus back on the patients, which is where everything needs to be. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you.
No, Tina, I think it's Pat Furlong. I think you're absolutely right to really extract the learnings from the COVID and from the rollout of those vaccines. I also see, and maybe this is off target, sort of a shift in primary care where people are going to drugstores, Walgreens, et cetera, to get vaccines, and to get, you know, the supermarkets have little clinics within them where general, you know, flu, cold, whatever general diagnoses are captured. So you wonder if you couldn't, as one of the points was, to educate the primary healthcare physicians in terms of clinical trials, right? So your primary doc is no longer taking care of the cold and the flu, but the primary docs are really places where clinical trial, should there be an infusion, you know, I totally agree with telemedicine, but in some cases you have to be at a facility in order to receive whatever it is the intervention might be. So could we decentralize down to a local physician who could facilitate genetic testing, who could be much more aggressive instead of, we did some work in Mississippi to look at barriers to diagnosis. And what we learned is, you know, exactly what we're talking about here, is that, you know, sometimes this disease isn't recognized, or the language used to describe whatever the concern is not interpretable by the physician. And so or in some cases, in some states and cities, the referral time to a specialist that would be relevant to this diagnosis is an 18-month wait. So the physician decides, well, I won't get on the list yet. We'll see what happens the next visit. So I think if we could decentralize and sort of raise move the primary healthcare into a different sort of framework where they would be able to facilitate genetic testing, more comfortable with genetic testing, and leave for lack of a better term, the common day-to-day issues that families experience of flu and vaccines and et cetera to the supermarket clinics and to the Walgreens or whatever systems. I think we might be able to really manage the rare disease diagnoses and certainly clinical trials that will be more approachable or certainly accessible to a wide variety of people instead of just a certain subpopulation.
Thank you so much, Pat. Great discussion, everybody. My apologies, I have to shift to the last question since we have 5 or 6 minutes left. The other question, maybe you can, thank you so much for projecting it. Okay, here's the question. What technologies, tool, or techniques could be transformational to improving inclusiveness and equity in the clinical trial enterprise over the next 5 years? Again, 5 years, so it's kind of more in the soon to be, time frame. So any comments on that? I know that you guys touched on telemedicine, mobile clinics. Pat, you even touched about the full, structure, if you would, the full infrastructure and the utilization of all this technique. But anybody would like to address this question specifically?
I think there just needs to be an increase in the willingness to try the new technologies, the wearables. You can do EEGs at home now. You can, you can monitor sleep with Fitbits or iPads or special watches. There's a lot of monitoring that can. I mean, we're being monitored whether we like it or not right now. So. And I'm okay with that. I'm not super paranoid, but if we can do it in all these other ways, why can't we do it for our health? So I think, and knowing research, it's going to take forever because you're going to have to do it in parallel. You're going to have to do it the old way and wear the wearables at the same time to see if everything agrees. I'm just going to throw this out there. I think so many of the assessments that are paper and pen need to be thrown out. They were designed years ago. 6 out of the 8 of the assessments I do annually for my daughter are just completely not applicable to her because she's nonverbal. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think using technology with skip mechanisms and dependencies and things like that, you can ask a lot more of a patient in a much, much shorter time with a much lower burden by using an online survey in which you're using technology to route them to the areas that are applicable, and they can skip all the other not apply, do not apply, do never, never, never. And I think that it's archaic right now, the fact that so much is still done by paper. And I know that's a huge FDA thing because you have to be able to, is it fit for
purpose? Yeah.
Yeah, so tracking where the data started and left, but I think it's beyond time for that.
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead.
And this is a discussion we keep having, but it's how do we move the discussion forward? Because I think there's this strange misperception on the part of the research community that the FDA makes us do it that way. But my sense is that's not correct. Actually, the FDA is not sort of wedded to those old things. But it's sort of I don't know what to call it, except a retreat to safety, a retreat to, well, it would be too risky to do something a new way. We won't get in trouble. Nobody's career will end, or we won't get in trouble if we do something different from the way it's always been done. It's really challenging to sort of move past that. It is true the pandemic has had, maybe some disruptive force that, may be good in terms of forcing people to say we have to do things differently. So there may be some good that will come out of that. But, your point, Megan, about, the way things have been done, and especially the point about if we do things a new way, it has to agree with the old way, even when the old way is usually a disastrous failure. But we still have to agree with that.
I was told that this is in drug development for my child, better to use a validated tool that the FDA is comfortable with that may be mediocre to measuring her whatever, than to do something that is more specific to the disease.
It may not be relevant, right?
Yes, but her disease is rare. It's not unique. It looks like 100 other syndromes. That means 100 other syndromes are using this mediocre measure because, well, everybody's comfortable with it. So let's just go with it. And it's just mind-boggling. And part of Rare X is we will not use what's there just because it's there. We have to test it and make sure it's going to get FDA and industry what they need. And that takes time and money. And nobody else has been willing to do it. And this is not rocket science.
Yeah. I just want to highlight that they might be moving us soon back to the session. Great discussion. And Megan, I hope we have more chance to talk about this because I think risk aversion, as Greg mentioned, is a big part of this. I think we owe the community a little bit more of an explanation and education, which we, of course, as an FDA, we're as interested in moving proven therapeutics fast to the patients, So we at least, I believe from what I've seen in the agency in the last 3 years, we want to facilitate, we want to be interested, we want to engage. And I think that's a big part of the discussion moving forward in the future.